Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks everybody for joining me today as we dive into another episode of the history, lore, and game mechanics for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 as we gear up for the release of Avowed. For those new to the show, welcome to the show. Happy to have you here. Perhaps you heard about Avowed and you're just trying to get into the world. You're looking it up on different platforms. You happen to find this podcast. Happy to have you here. On this show, we go through all the lore from the Pillars of Eternity games, which have already released by Obsidian Entertainment, as we gear up for the release of Avowed, which is supposed to release later this year. As well, it's just for those of us who love the lore of this world and the writing that Obsidian does to just have a chance to dive into it more, understand it a little better. Perhaps you're using it in a tabletop role-playing game. Perhaps you're using it for inspiration in your own kind of world building. Who knows? But we're here for that. In the most recent episodes, I've been discussing, a lot of what I've been discussing recently has been related to a lot of the news that came out about Avowed in January and February between all the podcasts that Carrie Patel was on with Gabe Paramo, as well as the Developer Direct by Xbox, and then just kind of diving into lore that was tangential to that. And now we're kind of returning back to a lot of the classic lore that we see from Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, which again is set in the same world. And going in line with what we were covering before all that started happening, I'm just kind of going through the bestiary, that is the animals and creatures and fantasy organisms that we see within this world. We've covered a lot of really interesting topics, all sorts of different fantasy creatures from, the spiritual and phantasmic to the mythic and the epic. In today's episode, I'm going to basically finish off a lot of the overarching bestiary categories. Today, we're going to be finishing off a couple of creatures we see in the wilder category of creature, Skuldrs and Trolls. Before we dive into the lore, just going over what it is that a wilder even is. When you're playing fantasy games or reading fantasy books or watching fantasy movies, there are a whole bunch of different fantastical creatures that you can see in these different fantasy-based media. And when you start to break down the differences in what kind of creature you see, you can put them in different categories. For example, you can have spirits, which would be things along the lines of phantoms and shadows and will-o-wisps and things like that. You can have vessels, which are the undead, or soul construct creatures, which were the last episode I just did. And then you have, in Pillars of Eternity, you have wilders, which is a category we see in other fantasy media as well. But in Pillars of Eternity, these wilders are creatures that have some semblance of sentience. They have some level of society and culture to them. I did an episode on Zarups, which are actually the same creature we see in the Avowed Developer Direct that you're fighting pretty much the entire time you see combat. Those are Zarups, and they do have their own culture. They're actually capable of even kind of like really basic religious beliefs. And so these are wilder creatures, but they're not quite at the same level as the rest of the civilized world. They're not thinking of those highbrow concepts maybe, but they're not implementing a lot of stuff. They're not entering into the civilized society. They're not exploring the world or increasing technology. They're a little more, I'm not sure how to put it. I want to say mundane, but I don't think that's the right word. But you know the difference when you see them for sure. We've talked about other wilders before with Zarups and Vithrax, which are psionic humanoid spiders, or ogres, which actually have a really interesting society, but they're way too hostile to play well with others. But yeah, today we're going to be talking about Skuldrs and Trolls, which are a little bit more of the animalistic ones than any of the other ones we've talked about before. No news going on with Avowed or with this show, anything like that, so we're going to dive straight into the lore.
I'm curious, what exactly did you find there?
Okay, so as I said, we're going to be diving into Skuldrs and Trolls today. Now, Trolls is something you've probably heard if you're into fantasy at all, so you're familiar with that. And Skuldrs, you might not know what that is. So we'll dive into that first. Skuldrs, in my own personal definition first, is kind of like a humanoid-sized bat-like creature, right? So they have 2 arms, 2 legs, and they stand up like a human kind of does. But they have a lot of the same physiological traits or behaviors as a bat. They have poor vision, and so they use their really powerful hearing to be able to kind of navigate their world. And there's even a variant of a Skuldr called a bogbat, which we'll talk about later. So they can develop wings. In fact, a lot of Skuldrs or Skuldrakes, which are actually have wings or vestigial wings or something like that. So definitely a lot of relationship to bats here. That seems to be the inspiration for this creature. It was one of the creatures that were early on in Pillars of Eternity's development. Pillars of Eternity was originally called Project Eternity. It was kickstarted by Obsidian Entertainment because they wanted to kind of make a game on their own, not having to worry about publishers and all that. And this was one of the ones, as far as I can tell, that was an earlier creature in development. A lot of information today is going to be coming off of the Pillars of Eternity fandom website, and it has been checked to see if it corresponds with a lot of the lore in other sources, and I'll let you know if there's anything that is and seems speculative on my part. But Skuldrs are described on that website as creatures that have poor vision, and they use a form of echolocation to perceive the world around them. It does say here that they can actually perceive spirits with this form of echolocation, and when I do look up the source for that, it comes from a forum post about a prototype for this creature, but I don't know if that means that that particular trait about the Skuldr stayed in, and so I'm not going to talk about that too much, but there was at some point the idea at Obsidian that Skuldrs would able to perceive the spirit world through their echolocation, so they could see the souls that people had in them, because everyone in this world has a soul, and there's souls and soul energy, which is called essence, everywhere around. But just that idea of having poor vision using echolocation is very much a bat-like quality. And if you ever look at one of the images of a Skuldr, which you can very easily do on this website or just through Google or by playing Pillars of Eternity 1, you can see a lot of similarities to that as well. Like they have that kind of really grotesque, ratty-looking face with the big pointed ears, huge like bat-like ears, and long talons and long teeth and all that kind of stuff. It's a very exaggerated fantasy evil bat, the kind of bats that you kill on sight in a fantasy world, rather than the ones that you just let fly by because they're part of the environment. Skuldrs are large mammalian creatures. They dwell in caves in total or near total darkness, and as a result, this is where they get their poor vision, and they rely on their sense of hearing to navigate and find prey. The protrusions and hairs on their ears allow them to detect airflow, which is a key to telling direction in an underground environment. They communicate through screeches and clicks and use these vocalizations in a form of echolocation. They are communal creatures and will nest and raise their young together. And it's that last trait that puts them in the wilder category of creature, because they do have a form of a society. So they are very communal, they are social, they do rely on one another to live and thrive. And so this is a type of creature that has lived in total or near total darkness within caves, and they have had to use sound to kind of get around, and they have these like extra sensitive little hairs and protrusions on their ears so that they can detect airflow, which would help them figure out where they are, because different points in the cave probably has different levels of airflow, I imagine. And so that's a Skuldr. Not a lot there to talk about. You do, as you would suspect, run into them a lot when you're exploring caves or ancient ruins, and so that's kind of where they've taken up shop. We don't really get a lot of history on where they're from or how they kind of evolved. It's still an interesting creature nonetheless. But when you start to get into the different variants, like the Skuldr Whelp or the Skuldr King, you see the same description, but we definitely see a difference in their physiology as they grow or mature. But as well, there's a couple of other variants of the Skuldr that are related, such as the Skuldrake and the Bogbat. Now, the Skuldrake, or the Skuldrak, I'm not really sure how to pronounce it, but I'm going to go with Skuldrake. They are superficially similar to their cavern-dwelling Skuldr cousins, and I'm reading this from the Wikipedia article for the Skuldrake. Skuldrakes are found in colder climates and typically at much higher altitudes. They boast considerably better eyesight, but they are still most effective as scavengers or ambushing hunters. While the skin flaps beneath the Skuldr forelimbs are entirely vestigial at all ages, young Skuldrake have fully functional wings. These wings are capable of sustaining their body weight at first, but once they mature, they can only glide for short periods of time. Like their hairless cousins, Skuldrak are communal and nest and raise their young together. Their close-knit communities depend on such bonds in order to survive the harsh climate. And so there we have the Skuldr creature, which has a little bit more of a bat-like quality, as we can see here, because Skuldrake is different in the sense that, well, it sounds like they might be a little bit more hairy, since they are contrasted against the hairless cousins, the Skuldr. But they also have these wings, which for pretty much all their life are just vestigial flaps on their body. They can't really do anything. As they get older, they can use them to glide, but it can't really support their body weight. But when they're very young, their body weight is light enough that these wings are actually capable of flight. And so there is a brief period of time in a Skulddrake's life that they are able to fly, which might be something of note if any of you guys come up against an enemy in Avowed that looks like a bat humanoid that is flying in the air. That probably means it's a juvenile. It's probably a youngin', which means the big mom or dad is somewhere nearby, right? So, prepare yourself to fight the mini boss, which turns out to be just a normal enemy down the road, I guess, but who knows? We don't know for sure that Skulldrakes or Skuldrs will appear in Avowed. They definitely have lore that would fit that, because I'm sure we'll be exploring very dark caves and ancient ruins, and there's good reason to say that Skuldrs would be there, but we don't know for sure. They could just be geographically located where the Pillars of Eternity game is, which is a different continent than Avowed entirely. Another thing, I guess, if you're thinking about like how is this going to look in Avowed, these enemies would probably be in larger groups. So I'm guessing that they're individually going to be easier to beat if we do see them as enemies in Avowed, and that it'll kind of be like Zarups in that sense, where there'll be a lot of like lesser powerful ones, and there'll be some that are a little bit more elite, and those will probably be the ones that are actually walking around versus flying around. And so those are Skulldrakes. The last variant I want to discuss is a Bogbat. Bogbat is different a little bit from the Skuldrs and Skulldrakes. Bogbats are differentiated from their Skuldr and Skulddrake relatives by several physiological differences. Chief among these is the fact that Bogbats appear to retain their juvenile morphology even once mature. This provides adult Bogbats with the capacity for flight, but it limits their prey to what creatures they can bring down individually. To that end, Bogbats are equipped with a noxious secretion which they spit at their intended victims. Bogbats also eschew the large communal broods of their larger relatives. They are typically found in small swarms and will frequently squabble over food, mates, and territory. So Bogbats are very clearly related to Skuldrs and Skulldrakes, but they're a little bit different. They've evolved or somehow developed the ability to stay in their more juvenile form even as they mature, so that way they can retain the wings. So this is a trait that they've somehow been able to keep, which is useful for several different things, but it has also changed a little bit of their Skuldr-based nature. They do still have, communities that they form, but it sounds like they squabble a lot more and they're not as reliant on each other. And it sounds like they also hunt prey individually, and that it has to be smaller stuff because they aren't as big anymore. In swapping out for the wings, there is less of a sense of reliance on each other and a little bit more independence. So a slight difference between those. And that is the Skuldr, Skulddrake, and Bogbat. And not a ton of crazy lore of where does this thing come from and what's the fantastic, amazing origin of this place, but still a lot of thoughtful lore behind an actually really interesting enemy, and one that I think is very sensible for us to see within Avowed. And not because it's some easy token enemy to put in, but because it offers a different kind of challenge, right? You have this creature here who might not rely on sight, they'll rely a lot more on sound. So who knows what the game's AI is going to be like for Avowed. There will obviously be a mechanic where if a creature or an enemy hasn't detected you, you can sneak around. But once they see you, obviously, then their combat AI kicks in and you have to start fighting them. These creatures, again, we don't know how complex the AI is, if they're going to program this in or not, but there could be this idea that you walk into a cave, a Skuldr appears in front of you, and if you don't move, then perhaps it doesn't react to you. It might investigate you, oh, what's that? I haven't seen that in this cave before. What is it? It smells kind of funny. But unless you start moving, maybe it'll just think you're something that got dropped there or that they forgot about it, right? So I don't know. I don't know if Obsidian will implement that kind of mechanic, but I kind of like that idea of being able to go into a cave, and as long as I don't move, maybe I could avoid some of these things. But once I'm moving around or I'm making noise of any kind, then they start attacking. That's a tiny little detail that would be cool, but we'll see. And aside from that unique mechanic, it is kind of interesting, right? If you're creating a fantasy creature, you stop and ask yourself, okay, bat-like inspiration for a humanoid-sized creature in a cave. It's cool fantasy stuff. These are the kind of things that I think you would see and read about or view in fantasy media, and it can very, very quickly become kind of a desperate situation, especially if there are swarms of these things. But let's not belabor too long on Skuldrs. Let's move on to Trolls. Now, Trolls are interesting, and they are there's a precedent set that they are almost certainly going to be in Avowed. They definitely are living in the area that Avowed is set in, which is the continent or large island known as the Living Lands. And we have lore from Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 that state trolls are in the Living Lands. So it is definitely true that trolls are in the setting that Avowed is in. Whether or not they're in the actual game, we don't know for sure, but there's definitely that precedent being set. When you read the description of a troll, you have this. These gangly giants stand twice the height of average humans. Their bodies are covered in large fungal growths which leak foul-smelling, pus-like fluid. Their oversized hands and feet extend to giant claws capable of rending a man in two. Dozens of slimy tendrils hang loosely from atop their oversized head, and their vast maws are filled with jagged, razor-sharp teeth. Trolls have long faces, long chins, long noses, and a tangled mass of wiry, fungus-infected hair on the tops of their head. They never use weapons and don't even wear hides. Looking at a troll, it can be difficult to tell whether they've evolved in harmony with lichen, moss, and fungi, or they've been overtaken by them. A troll's naturally clammy flesh provides ideal growing environment for these plants. They provide camouflage as well as some protection from the elements, and the enzymes they produce offer limited sustenance for trolls in lean times. Because of their symbiosis with these plants, trolls generally dwell in heavily wooded areas, although some may occasionally be seen in damp underground environments that also house an abundance of lichen and fungi. So aside from trolls being kind of established as being in the Living Lands where Avowed is set, there's also, I think, a little bit here that gives a little more credence to seeing them in Avowed, because it sounds like trolls have this symbiotic relationship with lichens and fungi. And if there's one thing I don't know you guys have noticed about Avowed in the trailers that have come out, but there's a lot of mushrooms, very colorful mushrooms everywhere in this world. So fungus and fungi seem to be kind of a theme for Avowed. We can even see it in the key art, which is gorgeous, by the way, for the game. And forest trolls have a relation to that. It seems like forest trolls might be one of the higher level enemies to fight, partly because you might not see them for a bit. They have a level of natural camouflage in forested areas, but as well, they're ginormous. They're twice the size of a normal human. They have all of these natural weapons like razor-sharp teeth, huge maw to basically eat you with, all the bigger to eat you with, my player character. And I imagine that comes with a healthy dose of a health bar as well. But yeah, these are forest trolls. I find it odd that trolls are listed as wilder creatures, since we don't see a lot about their culture or community kind of a style of living, because it definitely sounds like they're a lot more independent or they're a lot more isolated. That being said, of course, you can see instances in Pillars of Eternity when you're fighting multiple trolls at a time, so perhaps they do have some sort of society that we're not aware of. Maybe we'll learn more about it in Avowed. But we learn a bit about their physiology through this lore, particularly that they have a cold and clammy skin exterior, which, if you were doing first aid, is a sign that somebody is suffering something pretty bad. But for a forest troll, or just a regular troll in general, I guess, that's normal. And in fact, that creates the environment that the symbiosis between plants, lichens and fungi and moss, things like that, can grow on them, which ends up being good for them. So as we're exploring the world of Avowed in the Living Lands, if you're ever in a forested area, especially if you're seeing mushrooms everywhere, we could probably expect to see a forest troll. And my bet is that it's going to be one of the harder hitting enemies that we're going to have to really prepare to fight. I know it'll be interesting to see where they go as well. And I'm hoping that there'll be a little bit more learned about them, since there is such a precedent set that trolls will be in the Living Lands and therefore would likely be in Avowed. I'd like to see a little bit more lore behind the troll of like, what do they live like independently, or do they have some form of a society or community? Because I mean trolls don't just spawn on the ground, right? You have a mommy and a daddy troll, and so like what's the relationship between different trolls? Like, do they just meet up during rutting season like deer and create more trolls, or do they have some level of roles between them? What's the role of a troll, whether you're a mom or a dad? You don't know. But yeah, these are trolls. Now, a couple other things we can learn about trolls, which are consistent in other fantasy-based media, is that they have the ability to regenerate their health. And it doesn't really mention that in the description, but if you start going to other items within the Pillars of Eternity game, we can learn that about trolls as well, and we can actually kind of speculate how it might work. So there is a cloak in the second Pillars of Eternity game called 3 Trolls Stitched, and this cloak described as follows. This trio of hides still carries the unmistakable stink of trolls. Fluid oozes from the patches of fungus adorning the fibers of the garment, and mossy particulates slough off the surface with a touch. So this kind of talks about the trolliness, I guess, if you will, of this cloak, which is made out of the hide of trolls, or 3 of them anyways. And troll skin, as we've mentioned before, is difficult to penetrate. In fact, there is, I think it's called troll skin or something like that, an item in the game as well, which describes skin of a troll as impenetrable, partly due because of all the coverings of plant life on top of it. The cape retains some of the troll's regenerative properties. However, much like the trolls, it is highly flammable and vulnerable to corrosive materials. So it does have regenerative properties here, but the cape says that it retains the trolls' regenerative properties. And so there's something about being a troll, and this is true in other fantasy, it's just kind of a trope of the creature, that trolls are able to regenerate their health. And we're not really given a specific reason as to why. However, in reading the description for a troll hide belt, I kind of have an idea of how this might work. So this is a belt from the first Pillars of Eternity game. You can get in the second one as well, called the Troll Hide Belt. It's described as a belt that has been crafted from the mossy hide of a forest troll, with intertwined vines and leaves forming a solid, resistant piece of clothing. Any damage done to the belt tends to be obscured by new growth, for the moss and small plants which grow upon the belt retain some life. Though the resulting effect is somewhat like wearing a herb garden around one's waist, the piece of hide holds some of the troll's power, granting the wearer the creature's ability to recover from wounds. Here's kind of the idea I get from that, is that, well, first off, you might not be damaging the troll, you might actually just be damaging the plants. And so any health that comes back to a troll enemy is actually just the plants regrowing on its hide that was protecting it in the first place. But we also mentioned the enzymes that these plant life, these vegetation on a troll puts out, which is good for the troll itself. And I'm wondering if there isn't kind of like a bolstering with the soul energy that is in plant life and in trolls. Because as I've mentioned before, everything in this world has a soul in it, or has soul energy in it. Essence, capital E, essence. And the relationship to essence is really where a lot of the magic in this world comes from. And why a troll might be able to heal a lot quicker is because perhaps there's not only a physiological symbiosis between trolls and this plant life, but there's actually a spiritual symbiosis as well. Perhaps the plants are not only putting out enzymes that promote healing on the troll, but there's an actual regenerative process whereby the essence in these plants is helping bolster that regenerative process, right? So I think, and I speculate, there's no confirmation, at least not that I've noticed. If anyone knows of a confirmation for this, send me an email, World of Eora. My speculation is that the plants on the troll are what is contributing to the regenerative process of trolls. Now, I could be wrong. It could just be that's what trolls are. Maybe there's some like old lore in another book from another, I don't know, game or movie or whatever a long time ago that establishes why trolls can regenerate their health, and I just happen to be ignorant of it. But hey, I'm here speculating, I'm doing with what I can, and you know what? That's half the fun of this stuff, right? It's honestly half the fun is reading the lore, asking how could that work, and then kind of coming up with an idea. Now, obviously, it's up to Obsidian to make the canon for it, but still, this stuff is fun to do. So, and whatever, this is why I'm here. I'm going to do it. Anyways, that's all for today. I know that was a little light on lore today, and the creatures were a little bit more mundane, but I wanted to take a second to stop and look at these two creatures, because I feel like there's a pretty strong argument you could make that they're going to be in the game of Avowed. And with Avowed coming out soon, I'm trying to shift gears into like focusing on lore that is kind of related to that. I'm not saying that I'm going to ignore Pillars of Eternity only stuff. I still plan on going through a lot of stuff. I mean, I talked about Wix in my last episode, and I'm pretty sure that's going to be a Pillars only kind of a thing. But, I'm still like asking, what might we see in Avowed? And I feel like these are two creatures we might see in Avowed. Besides just talking about the lore behind these creatures, I also am hoping to like generate some interest for those who are like, well, I am interested in Avowed, but I'm not super interested in Pillars of Eternity. But now that you hear that these two creatures might be in Avowed, maybe you want to go experience them firsthand in the Pillars of Eternity game? I don't know, maybe you do. And if you do, you'll get to see how those creatures act in those games, and maybe you'll have an idea of what they might be like in Avowed, and hopefully you'll enjoy the game a little bit more. So that's me kind of like lifting the curtain there on my intentions on all that. But yeah, that's what we got. Today we talked about Skuldrs, a bat-inspired humanoid that lives in dark caves, in communities, and a couple different versions of them. Their wings are pretty much useless, but they sound like they could be a pretty terrifying enemy. And I'm hoping there's a little bit of light horror in the game of Avowed, and I think Skuldrs would be a great addition for that. As well, we talked about trolls. and how they are probably going to be a higher tier enemy. But we asked a lot of questions more than anything else about like what is their nature and what is their society like. But we were able to speculate based on their symbiotic relationship with the plant life that grows in them, that perhaps that contributes to their regenerative properties they have and how they can heal over time. But that's everything for today. And since we kind of already touched on a lot through this episode on how this has to work with Avowed, I suppose we'll just close out the episode.
If you find your trail has run cold, come to me with whatever you have. There is much I may be able to do for you.
So nothing news related that we have to talk about for the show. So nothing to go on there. I've been playing Desperados 3. I don't know if anyone else has ever played that. I know it's a little bit older, but whatever. I'm jumping into it when I'm jumping into it. I recently finished Blasphemous. That was great, and I just needed something that wasn't controller heavy because my fingers hurt after playing Blasphemous. And so Desperados 3 on the PC is very, I would say, dexterous light. Incredibly frustrating game at times, depending on like the path you take to try to succeed. For those not familiar, it's an isometric game, so, kind of like Pillars of Eternity, actually, in that top-down kind of fashion. And a lot of it is sneaking around enemies and taking them down without the others noticing. It's developed by Mimimi, who I believe put out Shogun Blades as well, which is a very same vein kind of a game. But yeah, it's a stealth action game, top-down. It's mostly about kind of solving the puzzle of how do you get to the location you're trying to get to without getting spotted, how you take out enemies without getting spotted, in what unique way do you take down the bosses or perform mission that it is you're there to do. And I've been really enjoying it. Like, it's been a very focused kind of a game. It's a game that you really have to sit there and just like, what the hell am I gonna do? You really have to ask yourself what you're gonna do next. You have to be focused. And for myself, just having a lot of like OCD stuff, literally OCD stuff, it's nice to give my brain that distraction every now and then and just focusing on how do I accomplish this mission. So it's been a great game. I'm looking forward to doing that. I'm only about a third of the way through, so I'll probably be playing it for a while. I haven't played Monster of the Week yet with my latest crew, tabletop role players, although we did give Lasers and Feelings a try. We'll wait until we try that game again before we talk about it. That was an interesting time, Lasers and Feelings, a very easy one-page RPG. If there are any tabletop role-playing groups out there listening to this, and you ever have issues with your group having someone missing and having to cancel or stuff, I highly recommend Googling Lasers and Feelings. It's a completely improvised game, and it's very quick and easy to play, and you can play fast and loose with anything in terms of like, I don't know, narrative cohesion if you want. It's just a fun way to play. But I also think that because it's so light on the rules and mechanics, that it's actually a really good way to practice role-playing. So especially if you're in a crew where you're like, maybe we should work on our role-playing skills, I think this is a fun way to do that. So yeah, Lasers and Feelings, loved. It's free, so check it out. Anyways, that's it for today. Thanks everyone listening for today's episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope this was lore that was interesting to you. I know I was kind of like meh about it when I got in, but the more I got in talking about trolls especially, the more excited I got. But yeah, that's it for today. If you have any questions, comments, or anything that you want to talk to me about, send me an email, worldofaora@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter, @worldofaora. If you've been listening to the show and you've gotten value out of it and you'd like to contribute to the show and support it in any way, please head to ko-fi.com/worldofaora. So that's ko-fi.com/worldofaora. And I just want to give a quick thanks to those of you who have gone on there and supported the show already. Like, I have sent you messages back on the Ko-fi platform, and I'm super appreciative of anyone who, like, if you've gotten the value out of it and you thought, hey, I'll toss this guy a little donation. That, I'm not putting the impetus. If you're listening to this and you don't want to, or you don't have the money, don't worry about it. This is just for people who want to do it. But for those who have, thank you so much. I genuinely mean that. That's like such an uplifting thing to see. And I really am happy that the show has been of value to you. And so I hope I can continue to put that kind of content out for you. But anyways, thanks for listening to today's episode, everyone. I've been your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and I'll see you guys next time.